welcome to today's episode on Researcher Revealed. For everybody who's just joining us or missed episode 1, I'm Rosalind Austin and I'm a nurse researcher. And today I have joining me Faye. Before we get into that, just a little reminder what the Researcher Revealed podcast is all about. This podcast, we are trying to go behind the scenes and to reveal the research behind all of those papers that you should be reading. So with that said, I'd like to introduce you to Faye Forsyth. Faye, who are you and why have you joined us?
Thanks, Rosalind. Well, I'm Faye, as Rosalind said, and I am a PhD student in the University of Cambridge. I sit within the Clinical Nursing Research Group, and I do research into heart failure with preserved ejection fraction.
Oh, thank you. Perfect, excellent. Right, now just for a little fun, we didn't do this with Sandra, she got off the hook, so we're going to have her back there. We're going to do a quick little rapid fire question round. So it's 11 questions. First thing that pops into your mind when I ask the question. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Tea or coffee?
Coffee.
When you're writing, music or silence?
Silence.
What time of day are you most productive?
6:30 a.m.
Are you a Windows or Mac?
Windows.
Okay. If you plan or journal, do you go digital or paper?
I plan lists on paper.
Okay. Where do you work, home or office?
At my kitchen table with my cat.
Oh, that sounds lovely. Your favorite referencing manager program?
Oh, EndNote.
I'm an EndNote girl too. Favorite data visualization tool?
RStudio.
Ooh, fancy.
It's the only one I know. It's my only one.
Favorite snack at a desk?
Ooh. Oatcakes.
Oatcakes, okay.
I'm Scottish.
Fair enough, fair enough. And what are you reading right now?
I'm reading a book by the guy that wrote Captain Corelli's Mandolin. I'm forgetting his name. It's called the War of Nellie's Underregions. Or something.
Ooh, interesting, interesting. Right, and last question on our rapid fire round is a researcher who you admire.
Oh, I'm going to say Christie. Professor Christie Deason was my supervisor, and the most highly cited nurse researcher in the UK. So
I think that's a very good person to admire. Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, Faye, let's get right into it. So you're a nurse. You're currently doing your PhD. Why?
Okay. So I entered my PhD journey through research nursing, as I think we have in common. So I'd been a clinical nurse working in general medicine for a number of years. And I always enjoyed it, but I had always aspired to move into research right from when I started my training. And I managed to get myself an early clinical career fellowship from something called NHS Education for Scotland, and they'd funded my master's straight off the back of finishing my undergraduate. So I'd done that at the same time as gaining my clinical experience. It was offered part-time, and so I was working clinical shifts and I was doing my master's, and that gave me my first sort of insight into research. It was a master's in research I did at University of Edinburgh, and then I decided that wasn't enough, and I wasn't sort of getting to grips with marrying a clinical job and doing sort of research. So I moved to London, and I got my first clinical research nurse post. And that for me is when I really start to learn about research and the sort of the day-to-day of running a research study. And my first job was in a gene therapy study in cystic fibrosis. So
Oh,
it was
wow.
really sort of cutting edge, totally hardcore, I would say, research, giving patients with cystic fibrosis a non-mutated version of the CFTR gene, which is where the mutation is. It was encased in a lipid, and they inhaled it. And then the idea would be that it's the cells in their respiratory tract take in the new gene and start making copies of that. So because it was inside fat and a viral vector. So and so it was
Okay.
very sort of, it was very cool. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, especially about regulations around trials, because it was a gene therapy study. But it was quite a short job. They sadly didn't have their funding renewed to the same extent. So then I moved to another post, and this was in genetics of obesity, and that was at Cambridge. And that's how I've come to be in Cambridge. And I've done a variety of other sort of clinical research nurse jobs since then, until my most recent post, which was about 2018, when I started to work with Christy as her clinical research nurse on the optimized HFpEF study, which was looking at diagnosis of heart failure preserved ejection fraction in patients living in the community, and following them up for a period of 1 year, and looking at a number of parameters just to characterize them and see how well they managed over a period of 1 year in terms of activity and hard outcomes like hospitalization and mortality, unfortunately. And from the back of that, having a great mentor who allows you to do more than you often are allowed to do as a clinical research nurse. So I was allowed to write the protocol paper. I was allowed to write some to the main publications. I got to go to workshops that they were holding on with the other group in Manchester. That they were doing their qualitative part of the study. So I got to learn lots and lots of different techniques. And from there, I decided, yes, I'd like to do my own research now, and I'd like to do it in HFpEF. And here I am.
Fascinating. Oh my goodness, what a journey. I
Yeah.
love hearing how people get into research, because I think everybody has a bit of a unique difference. Just to slow things down, because some people coming to this might not understand some of the things that we were talking about. So one, what is a research nurse?
So for me, a research nurse is somebody who specialising in the delivery of clinical research, usually in a clinical setting like the NHS. So generally they'd be responsible for reading research protocols, and then operationalising any of the clinical components within that protocol, namely about giving treatment or assessing people at the beginning, giving some form of treatment, and then assessing them again at the end. And so you get to learn lots of different types of clinical assessments, to develop loads of different laboratory skills that your bedside nurse wouldn't learn. So you know how to work a centrifuge, and you can pipette your samples like a pro. So that was my experience of being a clinical research nurse in the sort of the standard jobs that I'd done up until when I joined Christie's group. And that was when working with a nurse who was also keen to promote nurses become researchers. So got to cross the line a little bit and step over into doing some of the analysis parts.
Okay.
And that's how I progressed to become PhD students.
So I would agree with you there in that for anybody who doesn't know, I was a research nurse before becoming a PhD. And I would say the biggest difference from listening to your experience learning about research and mine is those opportunities that Christy gave you to start working as a researcher rather than a research nurse, where in some of the work that I did, even though I was doing some of those activities, it just kind of got magically absorbed. So I didn't get the credit. I didn't get the ability to co-write on papers and things like that. So it's really interesting, the difference to me that having a nurse leading your research group, how that resulted in a different experience, even as a research nurse, so somebody who typically just whatnot. So another word that you use that I found quite interesting in talking about research nurses, because I agree with this as well, is that you're allowed.
Yes.
Tell me a bit more about what you mean, both from the point of view of possibly like something that pops to head for me into my head straight away is we are allowed as research nurses, given we follow the protocol and we've got the right oversight, to give unlicensed drugs, for example. So tell me about, for you, what that freedom, how that translated both into your clinical practice and the things that you did with patients, but also some of those things that were behind the scenes that were different for you.
So in terms of you mean ward-based clinical work and clinical research nursing work being allowed to do? Well, when I was learning the ropes, I strictly followed a protocol, and I took great pleasure actually in creating lots of different documents to try and make sure that that was what was being done. I don't know the last time you read a big massive protocol for some
they're terrible.
unlicensed therapy, but they're not very accessible. So
No.
I often spent quite a lot of time translating them to be a document that a nurse could read and access and use as a template to collect the data that was required. And I think that was the start for me of maybe going beyond some of the things that were absolutely necessary of being a clinical research nurse. But you're right, I experienced similar barriers. I had aspirations throughout all of my clinical jobs to do more than I was doing, to be included as an equal member of the party in the clinical research game, and beyond some papers, beyond generally speaking, my experience has been that people are very generous, and if you have contributed in the shape of being a research nurse, then frequently, if you're not on the paper as a contributor, then you're at least acknowledged in the end of a paper, just saying, you know, the delivery was dependent upon your presence and your ability with patients to deliver the protocol. But yes, it's starting to reach beyond that. And it takes a little bit, I think, of experience of knowing stuff. And then getting in a group where people are willing to give you the chance to do it. So some of my other posts prior to the optimized HFpEF study, I got to do loads of things that I hadn't previously done in terms of meeting people for a big Horizon 2020 EU grant. I got to go to a lot of meetings and see how all of these things are reported. And I got to contribute to the periodic reporting for all of those grants, but that doesn't translate to a publication. That's to satisfy the criteria of the grant. But it was a lot of writing, and I think it was sort of confirmed to me that I think I had the capability. I just needed to go find the group where they would. I wouldn't be one of very many people who also had those skills. So when I joined Christie, it was just me and Christie. So so it was more of a team, and I came on the grant very early. I came on the project very early, so it was opportunity to shape, and we did talk a lot about outcomes, and then we did submit a few amendments to measure things that we thought were interesting as they came up. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but
no, I think you have. So what I was trying to pick at a little bit, because in you describing your journey to us, it was very clear the training that you followed. So you did the master's and you did some research delivery specific training, and then you did more training once you started on the study around how to conduct studies and specific procedures. But I think what I'm trying to understand is what was the drive? How come you were so determined to follow this research pathway? Because if I know you, and you hinted at it in your introduction, is that you actually have multiple different pathologies in which you've contributed to research protocols development or publications. And I'd say that's a fairly unique thing, especially at an earlier stage as a nurse researcher. So what is it that makes it, for you, research is the thing? And it doesn't matter whether it's cystic fibrosis, whether it's HFpEF, whether it's brain injury. What is it about research that is like, that's what I want to spend my life doing?
Yeah, you're right. So it started cystic fibrosis, and then it was obesity, and then it was traumatic brain injury, and now it's heart failure. But with all conditions, it's the same. You come across the same problems. People don't get access to the care that they require. The care that they receive is not optimized, and there's lots of barriers to treatment, and every disease is complex, and all patients are complex. And for me, it's always just about, there's a great problem there that we all should be contributing towards resolving. And all of the skills are transferable. So all of the research skills, it can transfer to any of the diseases. And I'm as much as I would like to have been a specialist in one body system, and I think it does have a lot of value in how you grow your research. But everything I've learned along the way has been highly valuable for now being a PhD student, and hopefully I'll be able to continue. I won't limit myself. I won't just do research in HFpEF, because I think I feel the same things. I see the same problems across loads of the chronic diseases.
Yeah.
And they say that traumatic brain injury is the most complex disease in the most complex organ, but I say no, it's the same for all diseases and all organs. They're all complex. And we can all learn from the other specialties. I have used so much of my learning from traumatic brain injury and the direction they were taking their research in, coming to heart failure. And they were, in my view, a bit ahead of the curve when it came to personalized medicine and having to really phenotype patients, because in traumatic brain injury, they say they only understand 30% of the inter-individual variability and outcome. So what's the other 70%? We don't know. It's about the person. And that's the case for majority of diseases. People respond differently to therapies, to care. So I think I would like to continue research in HFpEF, because I really feel like it's got a very, very significant need in the UK. But I think learning from other specialties is very important.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And similarly, don't tell people, I have got a varied background myself in research. In fact, my master's degree, I did it before I was even a nurse. I did things all messed up, and my master's degree is in neuroscience and functional electrical stimulation.
There we go.
So you're not alone. Okay, very, very interesting. Okay, so for you then, it is very much about, the reason you love research is it's that problem solving. It's that trying to apply techniques and methods around unlocking a complex problem in a pathology where there are no answers.
Yeah, it's about the unknown. And as much as I loved clinical work, I knew every day is different. There still is, I think, a plateau in what you do see. I mean, my eyes were opened extremely widely, doing nursing in Glasgow, but in one of the most deprived areas. But I still think there comes to a point where, not that you've seen all you're going to see, but you've probably got to grips with what with your patient group and with the delivery of care in that specialty, and even general medicine with all the madness that can be. There's still a lot of system-based care. You still do the same things, and I think it's nice to have a bit of freedom in your research to say, actually, this, we don't know about this. I think my only drawback would be is I don't feel like I get to contribute enough to the nursing agenda in terms of patient care and looking at, because I think that I research the condition HFpEF. I'm not researching nursing as a profession, and it's something I would like to maybe work towards at some point, but it's finding a link to what you're doing. I don't just throw it out and decide, oh, I'm going to go, this is what I'm going to do today. Everything has always linked together, for me anyway, in my head. There's been logic.
So I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit about that more. So when you say you're researching the condition and not the nursing care, like, I've just won the lottery. I have £1 million. I'm only going to give it to nurse research. Explain it to, like, what would your ideal project look like that does combine that sort of dream, just to kind of help me see what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of what we do in routine clinical practice is not underpinned by a strong evidence base. And I was looking back recently at the Marsden Handbook, and reading through that. I'd recommended it to somebody as an accessible handbook to learning a little bit about some clinical procedures and clinical practice. And when I was reading them, and I was reminded about how little of it is underpinned by any robust evidence. And that's not to say that they're not done well. It's been learned through a process of years, of how these procedures should be operated. But it still surprises me that there's so many things out there that we just do in nursing and take for granted as being evidence-based, when actually possibly it isn't necessarily as robust as you might think it is. I'm trying to think of an example.
Oh, so while you think, that actually twigged something in my crazy little head, is I think it was about a year ago. I'll have to look online to see if I can find, because it was a recorded talk. I was at a webinar, as you are, doing a PhD, and it was an eminent nurse researcher from America. And she said this phrase, and I captured it, like I screen recorded it, because I thought it was so powerful. She said, the thing about nursing and nursing care is that nurses know what works, but they don't have the evidence for it. And she actually was calling for nurses to become researchers so that we're start to be able to inform and develop research that turns that, I hate the saying, but that gut feeling, or that like warm hands approach, and actually turn that into science and be able to look at it. Because it's something, like, I know I felt for a long time, is that as a clinical nurse with more experience, we always blame our guts for, oh, that patient's doing poorly, but it's more than that. And so I think, like, her call for nurses to do research about nursing, I think, is that what you're kind of talking at?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's what I'm trying to get at, I think, because a lot of the things that I write about is about a system of care, or it's about patient experiences, and I it's less so about specific nursing procedures that would that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's just something that I think I would like to maybe head into in the future, and it's something I think we could do more of as a profession. I do recall now as a lecturer when I was doing my master's in Edinburgh, and she'd been a urology nurse, and they said they had a policy that was catheters had to be removed at lunchtime, and some such random statement was in their local SOP, and for the life of her, she could find no rationale for this. In fact, it seemed absolutely obscure. And then so she did a small study, I think, to try and establish when is the best time to remove a catheter. Is it the afternoon? Is it the morning? Is it the evening? And it's I think her output was that it should be morning or afternoon, so you've got a period of observation of the patient. But it's just that these types of things have come into our practice, and if you're actually to look back and work out where they've come from, then it would just be someone has written it at some point without any robust rationale for it.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's one of the things that the more I learned about research, and not just as because when you're doing your nursing training, they're like, oh yeah, evidence-based research, that's how you practice evidence-based this or that. But when I was doing my PhD, and you are encouraged and given the freedom to actually properly delve into research, that you do start to discover exactly what you're saying is there's very little, and the research that might be there, could be from 1960, when like the catheters are not the same sort of tech that we have now, or there's so many variables. And I think I had a meeting with my chief nurse like ages ago at the hospital that I work at, and she said this, and I've stolen it from her because I think it's brilliant. So I think the role for nurses in research is to convert from doing evidence-based practice, because do we actually have the evidence? But that's another question for another podcast. To actually providing care that informs the evidence.
Yeah.
And just, flipping it on its head and saying, okay, how do we know? And is it possible to measure, capture that this thing we do as nurses that, I'll keep picking on it because it's an easy thing to pick on, that gut feeling. And, we've all had those calls in the middle of the night, and we're like, doctor, we need you to come now. And they're like, well, what's the patient's observations? And you're like, well, they're normal. And they're like, well, I'm not coming. And you're like, no, come now. And, how can we unpick that? How can we start informing that so that it's not just this magical entity that nursing has, that it actually is like, we can say, oh, it's because of this factor. Excellent. Okay, that's really, really helpful. The other thing before we wrap things up today is, tell us about your PhD.
Okay.
So what is the research that you're doing? And aside from your training journey, that has got you exposed to Christy and that project itself, what led you to this research question?
Okay, so my question came off the back of working with our patients in Christy's study. So I was seeing them on the running the research clinic. We were doing a diagnostic workup, and they were getting their echo, and then it was being reviewed by a clinician, a heart failure specialist, and on that basis we gave them a diagnosis or followed them up. So I was seeing the patients routinely, and it was just something anecdotal, I suppose. A lot of them said to me, it's like, I would like to be more active. I'd like to be able to do more for myself, but I just don't know what that should be. And it's one of the problems in HFpEF is diagnosis is not often communicated, and when it is, sometimes it's coupled with the incorrect messaging, and so people are confused, and so that's when I started trying to put in some competitive applications,
Okay.
and that was the basis of my project, was going to be these work packages that was looking at patient experience, looking at what the evidence for diet was, looking at what the evidence for exercise was, so specifically diet and HFpEF, but the evidence for exercise in the multimorbid older adult. But my feeling was, from seeing these patients, was that they were quite significantly physically impaired, and routine cardiac rehabilitation or other types of services along those lines that I'd observed would not probably be suitable for them. And when I did look at some of the guidance out there, then it does, and some of the audits that have done, they can be excluded. Not all services, but sometimes patients who are really quite physically functionally impaired do get excluded from these types of services, and HFpEF specifically. So I wanted to do this research and culminate in a sort of a feasibility study with testing some sort of new multimodal intervention. So far on my year 3 of 5 years, I have done a qualitative analysis of patient experiences, confirming a lot of the things that I have just said, that patients often feel like they don't know about their diagnosis. When they do know about their diagnosis, what they have been told, it would not be in line with sort of current evidence in terms of the severity of the condition and what they can do about it. And then these factors, together with their other chronic conditions, make it very difficult for them to manage. And for a lot of the patients, for me, it felt like they entered a spiral of decline, whereby they were getting breathless, they were not then able to mobilize, and then the world gets tinier and tinier and tinier until they've lost a lot of their sense of self or things that they used to get enjoyment from.
So that's your first work package.
So that was work package 1.
And that's describing the experiences of people who have heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Just for everybody who doesn't know what HFpEF is.
Yeah.
I can't remember if we said that or not. So I was like, I better check that in.
Yes.
So that piece of work, that's completed. And are you doing your PhD by publication or traditional? And can people read about that piece of work?
Yes, you can read that piece of work, and I can send you the PubMed ID.
Perfect.
But no, Cambridge don't do PhD by publication, so I will publish all of my chapters, but I still have to write a traditional thesis. And so my diet work, the diet systematic review, I have published that too. That's been 2 publications, one that looked at the types of things that were, you clap, but it's because I'm so verbose I can't fit it into one paper. It reflects a lack of concise writing ability. So one paper describes what has been tested. So it was 25 studies, I think, but each one was quite different in their approach. So I couldn't really find a way of nicely combining them into a logical. Each one had something quite different about what they were doing. So there was there's 12 different types of dietary interventions I could find in HFpEF. Notable absences was nobody has actually tested a standard Mediterranean diet to see if it affects outcome. We all assume that it's effective because we have a lot of epidemiological data that shows that people who follow a Mediterranean diet usually have better cardiovascular outcomes, but no one has specifically tested that.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. There's a growing body of evidence about weight loss in HFpEF, and I think there's been a recent study, STEP HFpEF, which has confirmed that, giving the anti-obesity drug alongside an exercise routine. So that was the first paper, and the second paper was the meta-analysis looking at the actual outcomes from that. And overall, all the studies were quite small. So I was very cautious about my approach, and I used a grade system and I tested quite a lot of the the outcomes, although they might have been statistically significant, I was very cautious to make sure that that translated to a clinical benefit, and oftentimes it did not. And that's the beauty of using the grade system, because it encourages you to do that. You know, that might look statistically significant and it might look good, but actually when you put that into a clinical context, does it actually have that that much of a difference for somebody? So there was a few things. So high protein diet and a low fat diet did seem to improve some of the outcomes, but also as a caveat, oftentimes these are highly specialized groups, highly specific groups of patients. So it was very difficult to draw broad conclusions to say this is what we could recommend in HFpEF. Yeah. And my exercise review, so that will be 3 papers. Again, because I struggle with his ability to keep it small. So the first paper.
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing at you, Faye, but I have the same problem. So I understand the issue.
I'm very careful in that each one has got a specific message, and I justify it to myself. But anyway, the first paper will say is talking about, these aren't published yet, but I hope that they will be soon. I looked at the extent of intervention development that had been undertaken by exercise interventions in multimorbid older adults. And it's a big review. It was 51,000 abstracts that we reviewed, and include.
Whoa!
And there was a lot of
51,000 that you included.
Yes. That abstracts, that was the return.
Okay, that you reviewed. Okay.
Yeah, reviewed.
Oh, for a second there, I was like,
it's 138 studies I've included in the review, so it's still a big massive one, big review. So yeah, the first paper I looked at what underpinned the exercise prescriptions based on the descriptions in the paper. You know, had they done a systematic review? Had they, did they just defer to guidance, or had they, or was it on the basis of local practice? And unfortunately, it seems like the referring local practice seems to come out tops. People seem to test what they're doing in their local practice rather than going to do a searching for a systematic review that might say this is, probably what we should be testing if we're going to bother to design an intervention. And then the second paper is looked at intervention development as a whole across all the studies and their related publications, so any protocol papers. So that boosts it up to 258 papers, and that's, I looked across all the papers and all the publications to look for any evidence of undertaking robust development of their intervention according to a framework that was published in 2020. And again, and sadly not very well performed. Partly, I think one of the reasons is people don't want to publish that type of research, but and there is evidence. It's not, development papers are hard to write. It's hard to draw lots of diverse bits of information together and put it in a format that would be acceptable to a journal. So that explains part of the information of the results, but I think a large part is we do have a problem in research. We like to go from idea to testing, and we don't like to do anything in between. And I feel it's problematic. And it was almost what I was going to do until I did the reviews. So I'd come up with my idea and I wanted to test it, but thankfully in the intervening period, I got some good advice to say, well, maybe you should do some systematic reviews, which will work out what is already out there. And I do think that performing a good search of the literature before you do anything, it should be mandatory, because I think the majority of lots of the studies, in my review, would not have progressed if they had done a robust systematic review. And then the last part will test the different combinations of exercises that different interventions have used to see if it leads to any greater or lesser effect
Okay.
on quality of life, on a functional outcome,
Okay.
and maybe an activity level outcome, although there's not much data there.
I love it. It sounds fascinating. The amount of information that you've packed into there is massive. Both in like you describing your work as well as the amount of work that you're putting into your PhD. And I can't wait to read these papers as well as find out what you find out, because in my PhD, which as you know, was related to heart failure, it was one of the things that really put a fire in my belly about more research. Is so many times, and it goes back to what you said as well about wanting to do more research, and what is it about it, is that my patients and participants just kept saying to me over and over again, well, I would like to exercise, but I don't know how. Or the doctor tells me to go for a walk, but on Tuesday I do it and I'm fine, and on Wednesday I do it and I'm not fine, and I am not able to tell whether or not doing it is a bad sign or a good sign, because especially in heart failure, but in other diseases as well, their symptoms are so non-specific. And like, how do you tell if you're breathless going for a walk on Tuesday because, well, you're walking uphill and it's hard work, versus on Wednesday you're still walking up the same hill, but now you're a bit more breathless, but you can't really remember what Monday looked like. And actually your breathlessness now on Wednesday is because you're decompensating. And it's, I agree with you, there's so little information around not just heart failure, but lots of chronic illnesses and how we could better manage them. And it's just like, I don't know, it's like my own little personal pet peeve. It's like, oh yeah, that's part of their self-care. They'll sort it out.
Yeah,
But
there is
we
a lot
need
of
evidence.
patience. Yes, and I do think that there's a lot to learn from how patients articulate these experience, and whether or not we can, like you said, unpick those to help generate this information to help equip them better to work out. Yes, and I think that's also coupled in with the slow deterioration that people experience as well, alongside the processes of aging, and they lose their physiological reserve, that then makes it even more complicated to work out, what is a normal thing for me to be experiencing, given my burden of conditions and the symptoms I could expect to experience, and when should I worry. And I think patients are very, very good at it, but also very, very anxious not to be a burden.
Yeah,
And I think that complicates it significantly, and not just to clinical services, but their family members and friends who they might have to rely on to get them up to hospital. And I think, yes, we could do some more research that really unpacks that and helps us. It's about the way it's explained, I think, by the patient, and there maybe is patterns that we could identify. This maybe feels like this.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think it's not just in how patients communicate it, but I think it's also sometimes in how well-meaning clinicians, whether they are nurses or doctors, communicate things. So one of my participants, for example, was talking to me about her experience, and she was discharged from hospital, and part of her discharge instructions was like, well, if you have chest pain, it's a call. She now goes home and she's like, well, what do you mean chest pain? What kind of chest pain? My chest hurts every day. I'm 96. Everything hurts every day. What does bad chest pain look like? Is it sharp? Does it not go away? And like, as a clinician, and I've caught myself doing this, I know what I mean when I say chest pain, and I just make that assumption that because I say it, everybody else knows it. But for some individuals, what if they have, especially with these complex chronic illnesses, what if they also have some sort of lung disease that means that they do have chest pain every day? We don't actually want them calling us every day. So what for that person does bad look like? Anyway, I've just seen the time.
Yes.
I don't
Future
want to leave you
project.
forever. Just for everybody who knows, we said before we started recording that we didn't think we'd fill an hour, but
Yes. Sorry.
and
Let's
I
get
feel
on
like
that.
we've only scratched the surface. So for everybody out there listening, if there are things that in our conversation, words that didn't make sense around research, delivery, or doing a PhD or things like that, do feel free, drop it in the comments on the YouTube or on the podcast. We will get back to those questions and try and explain or give you resources if you need that bit explaining or you have questions around that. Secondly, in the description of the YouTube video, as well as the audio podcast that will be coming out, in the description, I'll also give you how you can track the lovely Faye down. All of her contacts on social, as well as she's very kindly provided a really good list of all of the some of the publications that she's put out recently, and that too will probably actually help anybody who is curious about Faye's work to unpick it and understand it a little bit more. Any last words, Faye?
No, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Rosalind.
I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on and getting to understand more what is driving your incredible and admirable passion around research as a nurse. So thank you very much for coming on to our episode 2 of my new podcast, Researcher Revealed. Thank you, and we will be in touch soon. Don't go away. Up next, we have the top 3 takeaways from this week's podcast by Dr. Rosalind Austin. Wow, there was so much in that. I knew Faye would be brilliant. I have talked with her and worked with her previously, and I knew that she'd have so much to pack into it. For me, top 3 takeaways from today's podcast with the lovely Faye Forsyth. 1, early exposure to research. So it's not the first time I've heard this in talking to other people, in that as nurses and AHPs and clinicians, the more that you talk to people who get into research, they say again and again and again that it's usually some form of early exposure to research to know that research is a possibility and that it is something that you can do as a career. So for Faye, it was her master's work and then moving on to being a research nurse. For me, similar, it was master's, then nursing, then research nursing, now my PhD. But early exposure to research equals a higher probability of becoming a researcher. So that's number 1. Number 2 takeaway is that difference. What is the difference between a research nurse and a nurse researcher? And this is a debate that has been going on for ages. Rather than getting into it now, I will put in the description a few publications and papers that go into that a little bit. But I think that's a really important thing, is that this podcast is specifically much more focused on understanding what researchers are rather than those individuals who are delivering research within the hospital settings. And Faye had a really good definition of that, so re-listen to it again. 3rd and final takeaway from today is her passion about why she loves research. And I thought it was really, really important to highlight that, is that for her, research gives her the ability to answer questions that aren't answered yet. And specifically, it gives you the ability to focus in on patients that need the research as a nurse, that you know them because they're the ones who always get excluded. So whether that's people with dementia, whether that's people who are too frail for exercise studies, but those people who often need care the most are often left out of research. So to have a passion and to be able to complete the training so that you're able as a nurse researcher to create research for the individuals so that we can answer those questions, so that our healthcare can become more accessible, treatments get optimized, there's less barriers even for those incredibly complex patients. So top 3 takeaways. 1, learn about research early. How it increases your chances of becoming a researcher. 1, the differences between a researcher, a nurse researcher, and a research nurse. And 3, that research is a way to be able to improve knowledge, especially in those underserved populations. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube as well as on Acast or whatever podcasting platform you've downloaded this onto. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.